Hello and welcome. I'm Julia Manchester, national political reporter here at The Hill. Thank you so much for joining our program today, Women Out Front, a program celebrating Women's History Month. This year, the theme of Women's History Month is celebrating women who tell our stories. I am so excited to sit down with women who are telling us their stories and their community stories. Women bring unique perspectives and skills to the table, and when they are given a seat at the table, everyone benefits from their contributions. We have an all-star lineup here today, but first, before we get underway, just a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillWomen. My first guest is Jennifer Klein from the White House. She serves as the Director of Gender Policy Council and has advised the president on issues including reproductive rights, gender-based violence, and women's economic security. I spoke to her earlier this morning. Take a listen.
Director Klein, thank you so much for joining us. You played an integral part in creating the Gender Policy Council at the White House. I would love to hear from you, how it was created and what went into it.
Thanks so much for having me, Julia. Yes, the Gender Policy Council was created by President Biden on International Women's Day 2 years ago. So we just celebrated our birthday. And it was created really as a continuation of the work that has been done in previous administrations. There have been women's offices, women's initiatives. Most recently in the Obama administration, there was a White House Council on Women and Girls. But this president felt very strongly, and the vice president, about doing it slightly differently. So that is why this is the first ever Gender Policy Council. And it really, the name really speaks to it. So the first is, while the other initiatives were really more focused on outreach, we are more focused on policy. So we sit alongside the other policy councils here at the White House. We are the Startup Policy Council, much smaller, of course, but with the National Economic Council, the Domestic Policy Council, and the National Security Council to focus on policy. And we do a lot of outreach and stakeholder engagement in service of that policy development, but really that's what we're here for. And the other thing is it is both global and domestic, which again is something that the president and the vice president and I personally felt very strongly about, having worked on these issues for, close to 30 years, and really noticed over time and really noticed in recent years in stark relief that these are issues that affect women everywhere in the world, and they really don't stop at borders.
Right. And what are some of these issues that the council is working on? I know here in the United States, and I've asked our Republican and Democratic guests in this, forum to talk about abortion and abortion access and what that means going forward. Obviously, the overturning of Roe v. Wade marked a big, upheaval here in the United States with how women get access to abortion. So what is the council doing in response to that?
So just to take one step back, the first thing that we did, again, required by the executive order that created us, was to write the first ever national gender strategy, which we did, and we're now in the process of implementing. And that really takes into account the work that is happening all across the administration. Really, nominally, every cabinet secretary and agency head is a member of the council, and they've each appointed a senior official to work on the council. So they've developed their priorities in consultation with us, and that work is happening. The strategy has 10 priorities, everything from health, as you mentioned, to education, to economic security, to humanitarian and development assistance, to human rights around the world, gender-based violence. It's a very comprehensive strategy. And also, I should say, at base, another of the underlying principles, in addition to this work needing to be comprehensive and these priorities are connected to each other, we also think about it in terms of the overlapping barriers that people face, women included, based on race, immigration status, disability status, other things. And we think about these things all together. So I will say that the only criticism that I heard about the strategy when it first came out was that it was overly ambitious, to which I respond, guilty as charged, because there's a lot of work to do. But all of that said, that work, that sort of very comprehensive and integrated strategy is happening all across the administration. And if I think about what I spend most of my time on, and the staff here at the Gender Policy Council, it's really three sets of issues. The first is economic security, and that's everything from equal pay and access to good jobs and childcare and paid family and medical leave. The second set of issues is preventing and responding to gender-based violence wherever it occurs, whether that's on campus, in the military, domestic violence, online harassment and abuse, or that set of conflict-related sexual violence, that whole set of issues. And then third, to your point, is health. And we focus on women's health more generally, but of course, for all obvious reasons, as you just noted, a real focus at the moment on reproductive health and rights, and in particular on abortion. Actually, this predated the decision that the Supreme Court made in the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade. But the president had asked the Gender Policy Council, really after Texas passed the law that they passed called SB 8 in September of 2021, which really was the first very extreme abortion ban to be put in place. We jumped into gear and started to think about how we can do everything we can to ensure reproductive rights and access to abortion in this country. And, of course, that has now become even more important given the decision in Dobbs, which, we all know, but just to always state it, the Supreme Court has never taken away a constitutional right. And that's what they did in the decision in Dobbs. So we're working on that in, I would say, three sets of ways. The first is on the federal level, fighting back against any sort of national abortion ban, and then conversely working to pass federal legislation, national legislation that would protect abortion rights across the country. The second is working with states, where, as we all know, they are really on the front lines right now. And so we are working with states to ensure that they can pass or fight against legislation in states across the country. And then the third thing we're doing is everything we can by executive action. So the president issued 2 executive orders last summer, very quickly after the Dobbs decision came down, to protect access to abortion and to contraception as well, to protect patient privacy, which is really also under threat, to protect the safety and security of people who are trying to get reproductive health services across the country. And then more recently, he issued a presidential memorandum specifically on medication abortion, because that has really become the sort of next front in the fight to protect abortion rights.
Right. And, earlier in your comments, you talked about intersectionality, or sort of hinted at that. And, this Women's History Month, I think, one thing we should, you and I are 2 white women sitting here having this conversation, is the importance of that and uplifting, other women of color, women in the LGBTQ, groups as well. How in organizations can we ensure that their voices are heard and give them the space for them to, thrive and become leaders on their own? Because it seems that, in feminism, a lot of times white women very much take up that space. I see it changing a little bit, but it still seems to be a white dominated space still.
Yeah, I think it's changing a lot. And if you look at the next generation, because youth is another category of people that we really need to be sure are at the table and heard, things really are changing. And I would say that is the answer to the question is, representation matters. It's not the only thing that matters. I always say it's necessary, but not sufficient. But it really does matter. And if you look at this administration, Obviously, we have the first female woman of color vice president, but really it goes way beyond that in the Biden-Harris administration. This is the first time there has ever been a gender equal cabinet with an equal number of men and women. The president has appointed more Black women to the Supreme Court in his administration to the federal judiciary than had ever been appointed in total. And then, of course, including the first Black woman Supreme Court justice. And if you look at the senior staff here at the White House or really across the administration, it looks like America. And that is what is important, is people not only having decisions made for them with them in mind, but having them at the table to make the decisions.
Before we end our conversation, it was recently Equal Pay Day this month. And despite us being in the year of our Lord 2023, with so many women in leadership positions, more women, getting an education, whether that means going, to undergrad, getting a master's degree, we're still seeing women working full time. They're paid an average of 84 cents for every $1 a man is paid. And that's even lower, I think, probably closer to 64 cents for women of color. Why is the gender pay gap still so narrow? So wide, I should say.
Wide, exactly. I knew what you meant. And just as you said, this question relates to your previous question, because you're exactly right. The pay gap is much bigger for women of color. And by the way, the pay gap for Latina women, for example, is bigger than the pay gap for Black women. And the pay gap for Indigenous women is bigger even still. So it's important to really look below that 84 cents number and understand that, as you just pointed out, the pay gap is bigger depending on, what ethnic or racial group you are part of. The answer to your question is, there's a number of different factors that make up the pay gap, and we're working on all of them. But this is true in the United States. It's also true around the world. We need to make more progress. And the three factors, one is what people always think of as the pay gap, which is outright discrimination. You're doing the same job as he's doing and he's getting paid more, or even a similar job and he's getting paid more. But the other two factors also require a lot of our attention, and this administration is giving it a lot of our attention for this and other reasons. The second is access to jobs. It matters what job you do. And, sadly, women, and again, women of color in particular, are overrepresented in lower paying jobs and underrepresented in higher paying jobs. So we need to do two things. We need to get women access and the training and skills that they need to do those higher paying jobs, whether that's STEM fields, to be scientists and engineers, or construction and manufacturing. And we have a tremendous opportunity with the implementation of these large bills that have just passed and the president has just signed, like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS and Science Act, to make sure that women have access to those jobs. We also need to be sure that women are being compensated in the jobs where they are overrepresented, like teaching and caregiving. So we need to value those jobs that, by the way, are the jobs we should value most, right? People caring for our elderly relatives, our kids. And then the third piece of the pay gap is also something that requires a lot of attention, and that's care. The other reason that accounts for why women over the course of their career make less is because they are often going in and out of the workforce, sometimes intermittently, sometimes leaving entirely because of their caregiving responsibilities. So we just need to be sure that people, women in particular, have the support they need to care for their families so they can work. And that obviously benefits them, gives them economic security and their families, but also, by the way, is an economic benefit for businesses and for the economy as a whole.
Yep. One theme I've heard this month, Women's History Month, is invest in women. More organizations, the government need to understand the economic benefits of investing in women. Director Jennifer Klein, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks again to Jennifer Klein for speaking with me this morning. Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, a Republican from Iowa, joins us now, and I'm interested to get her perspective on how she thinks the GOP has done with recruiting women candidates and appealing to women voters. Congresswoman Hinson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. It's a great month to celebrate the power of women and powerful women in Congress.
Wonderful. Happy Women's History Month to you. To get started with, your background is so interesting, and I'm intrigued with it as a journalist because you were a journalist at KCRG in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, before you became a lawmaker. I would love to hear about that process from broadcast journalist to Republican lawmaker.
Well, I think it comes down to that natural curiosity, wanting to ask questions and wanting to know why things are happening in your community and then what you can do to fix it. And so I had spent my career telling Iowans stories, the good stuff and the bad stuff, right? I'd seen it all. And I just kind of got to a point where I was tired of talking about it and wanted to start doing something about it. And that's when I decided to step up and run for the State House in 2016. It was a huge commitment. And, I think a lot of the thing that I've been focused on as a now member of Congress in my second term is saying to women, you are worth it. You have the skill set. You can step up and run for these jobs and you can add value. And so I am proud that I'm one of the Republican women serving in Congress. We have more than 30 now, a record number of Republican women. And I see it as my job to continue to tell Iowan stories and continue to tell the story of how you can step up as a woman, add your voice to the conversation and run. It's not easy to do. There's no manual written for how to do this. But what I think is important is mentorship, having those conversations and realizing that you do add value and you bring something to the table.
Yeah, and our conversation with RNC Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel will be coming up soon. And we chatted about, how to get, how the party and, the Republican apparatus as a whole is trying to support women within the party. And you mentioned the record number of Republican women serving in Congress. We saw 2020 was in a way the year of the Republican woman, but we've seen that Republicans have lagged behind Democratic women in terms of their representation in Congress and, down the ballot. So, what do you think the Republican Party could improve on, or the Republican apparatus could improve on? There are organizations like EPAC, Winning for Women, which have really started to improve on their margins in recent elections, but where's there room for growth?
Yeah, absolutely. And those organizations, ViewPAC, Winning for Women, Annalise Stefanik has done an amazing job, not only leading our conference as conference chair, but also in helping to do the same thing, right? Send that message to women that you can be successful here. You can step up and run. And I think too many times candidates, especially Republican women, focus on all the reasons they shouldn't run. I remember I was talking with a potential state house candidate, and when I called, she thought I was calling to talk to her husband to ask him to run. So I think that that's one of the things that I would have as a key takeaway is I'm passionate about showing women all the reasons they should be stepping up to run. So that's why I'm very proud of the apparatus that we are building. You have a lot of strong women, myself, Stephanie Bice, who I came in with, Beth Van Dyne, and that's just three from my class who I am thinking of as we're talking that I'm close with, and I know they are doing everything they can to help recruit good candidates across the country. Kat Kamak is our recruitment chair for the NRCC. Obviously, I don't want to talk too many politics here in this space, but what I think is really important about this is that we are spreading that message. We're doing the job. We're doing it well. We're showing the American people how you can govern effectively and that women bring something to the table. And my favorite quote is a Margaret Thatcher quote because it's if you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. And I think that's very, very important in this bigger picture about how we recruit more people to step up and run, especially Republican women.
And on both sides of the aisle, we are seeing that leadership start to trickle up. I know you serve on the House Appropriations Committee, and there are the four corners of the Appropriations Committee. Obviously, in the House, you have Republican Cade Granger and Democrat Rosa DeLauro. In the Senate, you have Senator Susan Collins and Senator Patty Murray. So what's it like to serve in a realm or a section of the Capitol that's literally run by women?
Right. Very strong women at that too, right? And Chairwoman Granger is just a trailblazer. She has done a phenomenal job as our chairwoman already. We're going to have some serious policy disagreements along the way, but I think this is a monumental time where, for the first time, the four corners in both chambers, this is being led by women. Women, I think, do a great job at negotiating and compromising, and I think that's what it's going to take to get things done this year. So I am proud to have these women at the helm. I have good relationships with both Kay and Rosa. I think it sends a powerful message to women everywhere. Hey, look at what leadership looks like. I mean, this is one of the most powerful committees in Congress, and it's all ladies at the top. So we've come a long way from just a decade or two ago when women had a seat at the table. It's our meeting now. So that, I think, is a very, very good place to be.
And you're also a working mom, and we know that a lot of women in Congress, Republican and Democrat, are sort of united by being a working mother, having to juggle having your kids, and then, of course, going to Congress, working on Capitol Hill. I don't see as many congressmen asked about being working fathers, but it's something that I think a lot of congresswomen, whether Republican or Democrat, talk about their experience of being a mom. How has your experience of being a mom impacted your job or helped your job on Capitol Hill?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have them on display, my babies. The two primary reasons that I'm in this line of work, their names are Max and Jax. Max is 12, Jax is 10 years old, and I think I'm setting a really good example for my boys. I still remember knocking on doors when I was first running for State House, and I had an older woman actually say, "Gosh, I'm really sad that you're leaving your kids at home." And I said, "Well, ma'am, I beg to disagree. I think I'm setting a great example for my kids of what it looks like to be a great leader and a great American." So in that vein, when I hear people like Don Lemon saying that women are not in their prime, I think I am in my prime. I'm in my prime because I'm a working mom and a member of Congress. It's not easy, but am I proud of it and the example it sets for my kids? Heck yes. There are no two better jobs in the world, and I think it does inform the way I think about things here. And I think we need more working moms in Congress because it is a different perspective. It's experience with some of the most important issues facing our country today, the true budgetary issues that a family faces, childcare. When I found out I was pregnant with Jax, my second baby, one of the first calls I made was to my daycare to make sure I could get on the spot, get on that list. So I am using that informed, I guess you call it, perspective to help work to expand childcare access. So I think that it does bring a different perspective. It adds to the conversation. And I think it's done amazing things for Congress to have so many working families here.
Congresswoman, I know you have to go in a few minutes, but my last question revolves around your state. Your state is an early presidential contest state, Iowa. We've already seen announced candidates and potential announced candidates making their swings through Iowa. It's only going to get busier. Nikki Haley is looking to make history this election year. I know she spent a lot of time in Iowa. Would love to hear about her, what you think of her candidacy, if you're excited about that, and if you plan on endorsing anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, and I have been welcoming all candidates to Iowa because we are first in the nation, and Iowa just has such a great opportunity and I think a great duty to vet all of our presidential candidates. I'm sad the Democrats pulled out of the caucus process in Iowa, but I am so glad we will have so many great people coming through, sharing their vision for the country. I was just texting with Nikki Haley this morning about a few things. So I think it's really great to have strong women stepping up to show everyone in this country you can do that. You can run for president in this country. So I look forward to having great conversations about issues affecting Iowans, issues affecting Americans, national security, domestic security, all of those things over the next couple months as Iowans work to vet our next presidential nominee, and I believe our next president.
Well, Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, thank you so much for joining us. I know I'm hoping to get on the trail up in Iowa, so maybe I'll catch you at the Iowa State Fair. That's on my bucket list.
Oh, yeah. Come and eat some fried food. I think it's pretty much on everybody's checklist who's running for president. So you'll see a lot of people there.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Congresswoman, thank you so much for carving out some of your time to be with us today, and happy Women's History Month.
Yep, you bet. Thank you.
Thank you. Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel has led the GOP since 2017 and is the second woman to serve in the position. In January, she won her re-election bid, making her the longest-serving chairperson in the party's history. I was able to speak with her a bit ago about increasing the presence of women in the party and the important issues that the party is facing. Take a listen. Well, Chairwoman, thank you so much for joining us. We saw that in 2020, Republican women were elected in, very large numbers to the House, and we saw them make improvements, across the country in elected office. In the Senate, we know that now there's 9 Republican women serving, in the House, 33, plus 2 Republican female delegates. And we've seen a lot of Republican organizations, EPAC, led by Elise Stefanik, and Winning for Women, work to recruit more Republican women to run for office. And I just want to know what the party is doing to really boost recruitment of Republican women and encourage Republican women to take the leap and run for office.
Yeah, so the RNC doesn't get involved in recruitment at the primary level, although this is a passion point for me. When I started as RNC chair, we went into the 2018 cycle. Elise Stefanik was in charge of recruitment for the House, and we went to the lowest number of Republican women in Congress. And through lots of discussions, we recognized it's not just enough to recruit women. There has to be a financial structure to help them get through primaries, and that's where Elise started the EPAC. Winning for Women started. It was certainly something I did when I was Michigan chair, investing in getting women to run for office. Our voices are so important in Congress. We bring a different outlook and a perspective, especially coming out of the pandemic, as many of us are mothers. And so I think Elise and the concerted efforts of the party have helped raise our level to the highest level ever of Republican women in Congress.
Right. And, we know that for Democratic women with groups like Emily's List, they've been at this for, a bit of a longer time, at least with the formation of these specific groups. But I'm curious, why has it been more difficult to get, or I guess, why are there fewer Republican women than there are Democratic women? I mean, what's the difference there? What has been the difference?
I don't know the difference. I will just say, for me, coming in as Michigan chair, I came off the PTA bench. I wasn't in the boardroom. I was a stay-home mom at the time, and ended up running for Michigan chair. So raising money was more difficult. I didn't have those networks.
Yeah.
And so I think these groups that are supporting other women are so integral, recognizing that we're all not coming from the same background. There have been groups that have worked on, called League of Our Own, is one in Michigan, where we actually help train women, give them campaign schooling, how to run a campaign, how to raise money. And a lot of those graduates have gone on to run for elected office. So I think we need more of this in our ecosystem. I'm glad to see it developing. And certainly, as only the second woman chair in our party, it's something that I'm very proud to see happening, that we've grown the representation of women in our party in Congress. But I want to continue to see more of that.
Yeah. And a theme that I'm hearing in a lot of your answers is the theme of being a mother and parents. And we know that a lot of Republican candidates and conservatives have focused on this issue of parents' rights in the classroom, especially coming out of the coronavirus pandemic. Do you think this is a way that could, appeal to more parents, specifically mothers, going into 2024? I
do, just based on my own life, right? So I'm from Michigan. My kids were shut down. And we're definitely dealing as a community with the deficits our kids dealt with, some of the depression issues that the kids had, with some of the learning deficits, and feeling like maybe I don't have the skills I need to be ready for college. We're dealing with a higher suicide rate across the country with young kids, especially young women who are, I think, up almost 100% going to the ER with depression issues. So I think a lot of the resources that have come to the states have not focused on mental health or these deficits that our kids are still dealing with, on top of the kids that have never logged back into the classroom. I think this resonates with women across the board, and certainly will help our party appeal to independent women as well.
Right, and I want to shift to appealing to women voters in general. We know that, last cycle, the majority of women went for Democrats, but when you look at the age brackets, you see the younger women typically leaning left, and as women get older, they lean more right in terms of the candidates they're looking to vote for. So how can the Republican Party maybe recruit some of these young younger women voters or maybe middle-aged women voters, especially those middle-aged women voters who seem to be sort of a swing group almost?
I do. I think they are a swing group. I think they were swinging our way on the education issues and the parental rights issues. And then Dobbs came along, and the Democrats were very effective at messaging and scaring women, saying Republicans wouldn't give life-saving care for things like a miscarriage, which is just untrue. So we've got to articulate our position, recognize in a post-Dobbs world, we have to get into that vacuum and not let Democrats define Republicans. But we also need to reach out to younger women. So the RNC has created a youth advisory group. We're getting women in there who are going to be on TikTok and Instagram and really helping to spread our message to younger women voters, which I think there's been a little gap between us and the Democrats. And I think when we do that, we talk about economic opportunity, the things that our party stands for, we'll win those voters over. We just have to compete for them.
Yeah, and you brought up the Dobbs decision, and I know you've talked a lot about this in your conversations and interviews since the midterms, saying that you don't think the GOP should use an ostrich method on the issue of abortion, that candidates need to confront this head on and sort of do their version of what the Democrats have done to Republicans and paint Democratic candidates as extremists on the issue. Wanted to hear, how your take on that, what that looks like in 2024.
So I'm proud to be pro-life. I'm proud to be from a party that celebrates life, but we have to understand in a post-Dobbs world, consensus is what's going to have to be found at the state level. And what we've seen is a vast majority of voters do support exceptions with some limitations. The Democrats are the ones who are so out of step with due date abortions, with gender-selected abortions, that's out of step with the whole entire world. That's more like North Korea and China. So we've got to not allow the Democrats to fill the vacuum and paint Republicans as extreme when they are the ones extreme on this issue.
Going into 2024, we are seeing, there's already a woman on running for president on the Republican side, Nikki Haley, and you see women in Republican leadership like yourself, Elise Stefanik in the House, Kristi Noem is a Republican woman governor, for example. How important is it, or explain the importance to me of having Republican women in those leadership roles and how it impacts the party as a whole?
Yeah, so an interesting fact is ever since Sarah Palin was the vice presidential nominee, we've actually had a Republican woman running for president on our ticket or running in that primary since then, with Michelle Bachmann or Carly Fiorina and now Nikki Haley. I think it's kind of interesting that it's become less of a big deal that a woman's running for president, although I think it is still a big deal. I don't think that was the lead news on Nikki. It was more her merits and what she did at the UN and less about her being a woman, which shows how far we've come. But I do think it's important that we have women running for every office in this country. Certainly women are capable of being president, vice president, Senate, and the House. I'm not endorsing anybody. We want to have it be based on merits, but I think it's a wonderful thing for young women to see, people like my daughter, to see that we have Republican women running for the highest office.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, that point you made about, Nikki Haley not necessarily leading with the fact that, she is a woman, because on the Democratic side, we see, they also lead on their merits, their background, et cetera, but they seem to put gender at the forefront, saying representation matters, very much making that a priority. Whereas Republicans seem to look at this identity, this issue differently. Would love to hear more about how you as a Republican woman approach this compared to how a Democrat would approach it.
Yeah, I would not vote for somebody just based on them being a woman. We want to make sure that you have the gravitas, the background, and the skill set to take on that office. And I think it's important to have women in the conversation, but I wouldn't want someone to vote for me just because I'm a woman. I think we want to be put in these offices because we're qualified. And I think that's what Nikki's running on. And I think that's where Republicans really settle on this issue. Although it is good to have more women voices, I think, in Congress, because we do represent over 50% of the country. And it is important that we bring that perspective. That's going to come through recruitment and recruiting good candidates and getting more women involved in the process. But the voters will determine the best candidate based on their qualifications, not on their gender.
And my final question is, I know you can't obviously endorse as the chairwoman, but do you think having a Republican woman on the ticket next year could, boost the party and boost the ticket and the challenge against whoever the Democrat is, assuming it's Joe Biden?
That's a minefield I'm not going to get into. I'm just not going there. It's a good try. It's a good try. Listen, whoever the nominee is should be able to choose the vice president that works best with them. And as I said before, we're based on merits. We're not going to vote for somebody just based on their gender. And so whomever ends up winning that nomination should be able to determine the best person to be the vice president.
Well, Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel, thank you so much for joining us, and happy Women's History Month.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Happy Women's History Month.
Senator Jackie Rosen of Nevada is a former computer programmer and is a champion for investing in STEM. She's the co-founder and co-chair of the first ever bipartisan Women in STEM caucus in the Senate. Welcome, Senator Rosen, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today.
Well, it is so exciting to be here. Thank you for having me. There's nothing more that I love to talk about than women in STEM.
Excellent, excellent. And we will get to that, but just wanted to touch on a few news of the day questions, particularly out of your home state of Nevada. We know that Judith Whitmer, the former Nevada Democratic Party co-chair, was voted out. And now we have Assemblywoman Danielle Monroe-Marino taking her place. It seemed like there was a bit of an intra-party struggle there, and something we're sort of seeing broadly in the Democratic Party across the country. Wanted to get your reaction to that piece of news.
Well, first of all, last weekend, Danielle Monroe-Marino had a historic win, first overwhelming win, number one. And number two, she made history as the first Black woman to head Nevada Dems. And so we're very excited, her and the Unity slate, with their overwhelming win, what they're going to bring to the coordinated campaign. We know Nevada is a battleground state. Races are always tough there. I'm top of the ticket. It's going to be one of the most competitive races in the country. We need to be on our game, registering voters, getting our message out, and being sure that everybody comes out to vote. That's what we do best in Nevada, and Nevada Dems with Chairwoman Monroe-Marino at the helm will be ready to do that for us.
Yeah, and of course, the chairwoman will be at the helm when you face re-election next year. And we know that your colleague, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, faced a very close re-election, but ultimately came out on top in that race. Going into 2024, how are you feeling? We know you don't have an opponent yet. Obviously, it's still very early in the game, but how are you feeling? What are you doing to prepare?
Well, I can tell you that I've been here for the last 6 years. So the first thing you do to prepare is be sure that you're working on the kinds of things that show people in Nevada how you're investing in them. So whether it's our Nevada families, our Nevada seniors, $35 insulin, free vaccinations. I urge everyone to get that shingles shot. So important. My parents suffered from that when they were alive. But our veterans, we passed the PACT Act for good paying jobs. We have the bipartisan infrastructure law, investing in our airports, our roads, broadband, particularly in our underserved and rural communities all across the frontier parts of Nevada, really important. So we're going to continue to do that good work, but we have to get the message out, and we have to organize voters to be sure that they know who to vote for. That's where the Nevada Dem Party comes in. The organization there with the coordinated campaign will help us register those voters, be sure that they understand the stakes. We are ready to do that. We're starting to organize now.
Right. So I want to talk about your story and how you got into politics, but also how you got into computer programming. I mean, it's amazing because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were a computer programmer, and then the late, great Senator Harry Reid ended up calling you and, encouraged you to run for office. How did that all play out, and what has it been like serving in really two male-dominated fields?
Well, I'll tell you that I was getting a degree in psychology. I was at University of Minnesota at the time, and I was working on some research, and I was told to go down to the math department and share some of the information. So the guys in the math department, it was mostly guys back then, would help make a program for you to show how they use the data. Well, I kept going down there to work on this research project, and I loved what they were doing. So I started taking a few classes, but I was already far enough in my degree that I completed my degree in psychology. I then moved to Nevada, followed my parents out there. They moved to Nevada in 1970, 75 or 76, and came out to Nevada and really wanted to work in computers. And so I continued to take classes. Actually, at what's now College of Southern Nevada, I got a job at Summa Corporation, which was the Howard Hughes companies, and began my career as a computer programmer, which was very exciting. I stayed doing that until I left my career, and we'll talk about this too, to take care of my parents and in-laws as they aged. They had a lot of responsibility there, and I stepped away. And it was right after they passed away that Senator Reed did come and speak with me about running for Nevada's 3rd Congressional District. What he shared with me was something that I think is really important for people to understand. He said, "You're going to make a difference." He said, "How are you going to make this difference? Let me tell you. You're going to listen to the stories of the families in your state, up and down, of the businesses, large and small. You're going to hear all the things that are important, what people worry about, what they wish for. You're going to take those stories to Washington, and you're going to work on legislation that brings those stories forward. Your constituent services are going to help people in the state. Again, like I said, hearing their stories, helping them, whether it's Social Security, disability, veterans, Medicare, and the like." And so when he explained it to me that way, the connection between taking the stories, understanding what matters to people, and then how do you connect those two, that's what convinced me to run for Congress. I won for Congress in 2016. I took the leap to run for Senate in 2018, and here I am up again for election in 2024. We've been doing the good work, and now it's a matter of just continuing that and getting out the vote.
I love that you talk about, him saying that you'll get a chance to tell those stories, because the theme of Women's History Month this year is women who tell stories. So that meshes perfectly. But one of the stories you have told as a lawmaker is the story of getting more women and pushing for more women to get involved in STEM, and, also girls, because we understand that this begins at a very young age. I want to get your perspective on where we are as a country in terms of women and girls at the younger age getting involved and being involved in this field. It still seems like it's very male dominated. It still seems that younger girls, younger women are often pushed in maybe a different direction when it comes to career paths. But where do you feel that we are as a country on this issue?
Well, I think you're exactly right. We still have a minority of women in all the STEM field, which is why one of the first bills I was lucky enough to get signed into law was my Building Blocks of STEM, which uses programs with the National Science Foundation to help teachers, particularly in those young grades, to be able to bring these kind of plug and play programs into the classroom. What does that mean? I want kids, young boys and girls, but especially girls, to see the creativity in these jobs. One thing that I loved about my job as a computer programmer is that it was a problem-solving job. Someone came to you with something they hoped to do or a problem they wished to solve, and it was up to you to figure out how you did that. And it is creative, it is dynamic, it is ever-changing. You are always learning. And I want young girls to see that those kinds of things are for them, not for somebody else, that they can use the natural skills they have to compete and to work in these jobs, and they're really fulfilling, and they're not for someone else. I think girls are particularly suited, the attention we pay to detail, our ability to communicate, so many things. And so the younger we bring these programs down in the classroom, the more open young minds are for them to be able to absorb these kinds of concepts and realize that they're exciting to them.
And I would love to chat more about why it's so important to have women in STEM and what they bring to the table. There was an interesting Pew Research study out last week that talked about the gender pay gap in this country. And part of the reason for that gap was because there aren't as many women in these fields like STEM that tend to pay more. So, why is it so important to have these, women in these, leadership positions in STEM? I mean, what does that do for the field as a whole?
Well, whether you have women in medicine, engineering, chemistry, math, computer programming, all the STEM fields, and there's so many more than that. Accounting is STEM. You can have people become CFOs of an organization if they're an accountant, right? And so it's really important to have the diverse voices and give women a pathway there. It matters. And so I just think it's important all the way around for women to understand that these paths are open to them. Give them the resources and opportunity to pursue that. And also, I would argue that we're going to have a lot of challenges in this 21st century. And we know that somewhere right now in the third grade, whether it's a young man or a young woman, there's a kid out there who's going to solve, maybe invent the next great thing, write the next symphony. Maybe they'll write the next big musical like Hamilton, or maybe they'll cure a disease. We don't know. But we have to be sure that our education is robust enough to allow kids to see the possibilities that are out there for them, to see themselves doing these jobs so that they can take on these challenges when they graduate. That's what's important, and particularly in STEM, because healthcare, engineering, biology, and chemistry, all of those things so important to our lives. And of course, cybersecurity, computer science, technology, all that, we live with it every single day.
You know, my final question to you has to do with your colleague, Senator Shelley Moore Capito from the Republican side of the aisle. It's been really, cool and interesting to see two women from both parties on Capitol Hill really tag team this issue. I'd love to hear more about that, some of the progress you've been making, and would love for you to highlight anything that's in the works.
Well, Senator Capito and I can tell you we have a good friendship, and we thought about all these ways that we can empower young girls. Here we are. There's a minority of women still in the United States Congress and in the United States Senate. So we wanted to show girls that they can have any career that they dream of, that they should see themselves in there, and that STEM was a really great way to do it. And so, of course, we're reintroducing our STEM Restart Act. So if you have taken time off work for childcare or caregiving, like I did for my parents and in-laws, this allows you to get training, retrained as if you've stepped away from your career. So if you want to reskill or upskill, that's really important, the STEM Restart Act. We're also working on another bill for small business access for childcare. This is really important, again, for caregivers to empower women who are taking care of their families to have access to quality, affordable childcare. And what this bill will do, actually I'm on this bill with Senator Ernst, is to allow nonprofit childcare to have access to small business, all the small business capabilities. So if you're a church or a synagogue or a Boys and Girls Club, there's childcare deserts, urban and rural, all across this country for affordability. We want those trusted sources to be able to have access to resources to bring that down. So there are a couple of things we're doing there. We're going to continue to work on the education front, but we have to support women doing it now and young girls going forward into the future.
Absolutely. And we're so grateful for the work that you and Senator Capito are doing on this issue. And I encourage our viewers right now, for those tuning into this event, to not think about and learn about STEM just on Women's History Month, but to continue the work going forward and to encourage young girls and women to get involved in this field. Senator Rosen, thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My next guest is the first Indigenous American to serve as a cabinet secretary in the United States. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so Secretary, just to start off with, you weren't only the first Indigenous American to serve as a cabinet secretary, but you were also one of the first Indigenous Americans to serve in Congress, along with Congresswoman Sharice Davids. And then, of course, we know that Congresswoman Mary Peltola, an Indigenous Alaskan, is now serving in Congress. I want to get your take on what is needed in terms of representation of Indigenous communities in Congress or in legislatures, really, in countries like Canada, for example, Latin America, because it seems that while we obviously celebrate these first, obviously major achievements, it's not enough. And I can't believe in the year of our Lord, 2023, we're still naming first like this.
Absolutely. And when I won my election to Congress, one of the first two Native women in Congress after over 200 plus years, the first thing I said was, I'm the first, but I don't want to be the last. So it's important that we continue to do everything we can, right? Representation matters. And I think there are Indigenous children out there, Indigenous girls who will never know what it's like to not have a Native American woman in Congress, and so or in the cabinet, perhaps. So it's up to us to make sure that we are always doing what we can to make sure that we have a voice, and that is helping folks to recognize their own voice and helping them to realize that they can be a voice for their communities as well.
So where does that start in terms of reaching out to those young Indigenous girls and members of the Indigenous community in general, going into, recruiting them to run for office? I mean, do you think this is something that, more organizations, outside organizations with recruiting candidates need to get involved? Do you think there's an infrastructure for that right now as we speak?
Well, in my position now, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is part of this department, the Department of the Interior. So I travel to Indian country often for various issues, for natural resource issues, for the Bureau of Indian Education issues. We travel to Indian country often and meet with tribes as often as we can. And I feel like, part of it is, yes, we're going to get the work done, but I feel that if people are inspired, then they will want to be involved as well. So it's a matter of us making sure that we help people to know how important their voices are.
One of your initiatives that is obviously so incredibly important is the establishment of the Missing and Murdered Unit, obviously targeted towards, trying to alleviate the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous young women and girls and, women of all ages, obviously, in this country. I wanted to get your take on that issue because on one hand, I think this isn't an issue we talk about enough, but on the other hand, I see this issue being portrayed and, increasingly in the media. Yellowstone, Dexter, Alaska Daily. These are all television shows that have had storylines about this issue. You hear it, covered a bit more in the media. But the problem doesn't really seem to get better. Would love to hear about how the Missing and Murdered Unit is going to alleviate or, solve ultimately this problem, or if it can.
Absolutely. So we started the Missing and Murdered Unit here at the department because we felt that it was important that we dedicate professionals to solving these crimes. And we've had opportunities to solve missing persons cases, murder cases. We've been able to, give families the information that they've been longing to hear in some respects. And so it's always important that we continue to move forward with this unit to solve the cases that were forgotten about. One of the reasons I came to Congress in the first place was to elevate this issue. And I remember being in my home, in my in my city of Albuquerque, going to, we'd have these rallies where maybe 10 people would show up to bring attention to missing and murdered Indigenous people. Now it's clearly a mainstream issue. The more people that talk about it, the more attention gets paid to it. While I was in Congress, I was able to get a bill passed called the Not Invisible Act, and now we're implementing the Not Invisible Act Commission here at the department, bringing in members of the communities, members of law enforcement, survivors, and the families of survivors to huddle, to talk about what it is that we can do to make this issue better, the steps we need to take to make sure that our people do not go missing in the first place, but how can we solve these issues in the best possible way? So yes, thank you for recognizing that attention is definitely being paid to this, and we just need to keep working at it.
I think a lot of non-Indigenous people, when they hear about this issue, the first thought they have, and they're pretty unfamiliar with the background, is, Why Indigenous women and girls? Why is this problem still persisting, or why has it persisted in the first place? Obviously, I'm sure a book could be written on this topic. There have been books written on this topic, I believe, about generational trauma, colonization. But in your view, why is this a huge problem in Indian country, in North America, as well as in Latin America?
Well, for one thing, it's an issue that's been happening for the past 500 years. From the first time colonizers came to the North American continent, they have been stealing women, stealing girls, stealing children. It's happened over and over again. And so it's not an issue, it's been persistent for this long. We're working on the boarding school initiative, and quite frankly, a lot of those children were just taken from their families, taken away and sent off to boarding school. Sometimes their families would never see them again for as long as they lived. This has been a persistent issue, as I said, for the last 500 years. And so we're going to keep working at it, because for an issue that's lasted for this long, it's going to take a concerted effort. It won't be solved with one law or one policy, but rather a group of policies, a group of laws, and all of us need to be dedicated to seeing its end. So we'll keep working at it, and I'm very happy to be in a position I am to move this issue forward.
What's it like working with state and local governments on this issue? Because as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the problem area of this issue lies in that a lot of these, tribal lands are sort of situated in places where the jurisdiction isn't unclear, and it's unclear, who faces justice, who doesn't face justice. If you're non-Indigenous, you commit a crime, who are you reporting to in that case? Has there been efforts to really clarify that?
Well, absolutely. Jurisdictional issues are always a big headache with regard to Indian country and who has jurisdiction. So we'll keep working at that. I am pleased to know that many states, in fact, have worked hard on this issue. The state governments are working with their tribal communities and their tribal nations to work together to solve the issue. My home state of New Mexico has a missing and murdered Indigenous peoples task force. I know in Wyoming, the governor there has worked with two tribes to bring this issue to light. A lot of these, kidnappings, a lot of these murders, they happen in very remote locations. So that means that we need to do our best to make sure that, tribal police forces are trained in how to respond, and that we can connect our communities with internet, right? Mm-hmm. That's been one of the issues all along as well, that remote Indian tribes haven't had the connections they need to make phone calls or to report something. So the more, it's not just it's not a one, you can't solve this, as I said, with one issue. It's going to take a concerted effort across the government to make sure that all of us are working together to have the infrastructure that we need, to have the law enforcement that we need, to make people aware. And so I am committed to this work, and we'll keep doing what we're doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Secretary Haaland, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and talk about this issue that is, I can't believe we're still talking about it now. It's awful that we have to talk about it in the first place, but thank you for joining us and really helping us shed a light on it.
And thank you very much for shedding the light on it.
My next guest spent almost a decade as a CIA operations officer. Now she's a third-term Democratic Congresswoman from Virginia who was just named to one of two committees that oversees the work of America's spy agencies. Welcome, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger. Happy Women's History Month.
Thank you for having me.
Just to start out, you were elected in a huge wave of Democratic women in 2018, really coming into a male-dominated space. But you also came from a male-dominated space when you were serving in national security in the CIA. You know, there's a 19th News article that says that women still only make up 20% or around 20% of the workforce in the national security sector. So I wanted to get your perspective first or your experience versus serving as a woman in the CIA and national security and then serving in Congress as a woman.
Well, certainly they are both majority male in terms of the workforce. But I think it's incredibly important that we continue to have more women, more people of various experiences, life experience, work experience, personal experience, serving in our intelligence community. Certainly bringing that perspective is important as we're working to protect the nation's secrets and protect the United States. But importantly, within the halls of Congress, people of various different experience sets add a lot to the discussion. And so I'm proud to be representing Virginia's 7th District and bringing my skill set, certainly as a former national security professional, as a CIA case officer, as a mother, as a wife, as a woman with a broad set of experiences and skills. I hope that that is to the benefit of the people that I represent and certainly the lawmaking process.
Right. And going back to the CIA and the national security sector as a whole, how can we get more women to serve in this space that's been male dominated for so long?
It's an issue of encouraging, I think, young people to understand what it is that happens in the national security world, what happens at CIA or NSA or DIA or any of the other nations' intelligence services, and encouraging people to apply, encouraging people to just, potentially see if it's for them. You don't have to be 100% sure you want to work in the national security sector to apply. So read about it, learn about it. Nowadays there's movies, there's podcasts, there's books. Explore it, and ideally, many more people will think that working in support of our national security might be the right fit for them.
Right. And then moving into the political space, obviously, there are so many groups, on the Republican side and the Democratic side. On the Dem side, I think of Emily's List, for example, that works really hard to recruit women to run for office at all levels of the ballot. What more can we do to recruit or encourage more women to run for office, whether it's state and local or at the federal level?
Well, having more voices, more experience sets, more people just committed to service, running for office, and ultimately legislating or governing, depending upon the role that they're in, but representing people is important. There's another organization called Emerge. They put on regular training programs. So anyone who thinks they might be interested in running for office, they can follow up with Emerge Virginia, take one of their training classes and just explore it as an idea. What goes into running for office? What would motivate someone to run for office? And helping people really kind of work through why it is that they might want to serve in a particular way at the local level, state level, or federal level is an important first step. And I think that there's so many incredible people across certainly the Commonwealth of Virginia, but the country as a whole, and bringing additional people of various skill sets and experiences, but kind of united in their passion to serve their communities in our country is important. And bringing new voices into politics is extraordinarily important.
Right. And, so we talked about the link between, I guess, getting more women to serve in both of these fields or, at least pursue careers in both of those fields. And I think you touched on this at the beginning, but I would love to hear about how your work in the intelligence or the national security sector in the CIA is influencing your work, especially on your new committees now on Capitol Hill.
Well, certainly having been a practitioner within the intelligence community, a case officer. So I worked undercover for the entirety of my time. I was recruiting foreign nationals to commit espionage and provide information, provide secrets to help inform U.S. policymakers and help keep our country safe. It's a unique perspective. It's a small group of people who have ever had that experience. at CIA. And so to be able to bring that perspective to Capitol Hill as we conduct oversight, it's incredibly important that my colleagues who have not served in that space, have the ability to really dig into what does it mean to be an intelligence officer? What is the day-to-day experience like? And it's pretty, I'll say honestly, it's pretty fun for me at this point, having once written intelligence reports that were used by analysts to kind of put out products for legislators, to now be on the other side reading those intelligence reports and reading those finished products of analysis, helping to inform the policy that we're making.
Yeah. And, just to move to more news of the day topics, for example, we know that there's been a lot of headlines involving China, Chinese surveillance, whether it is this Chinese spy balloon, for example, or even, how China could be surveilling U.S. citizens through, apps like TikTok, for example. What are your views on how the U.S. should approach its relationship with China going forward? It's in a very fragile state. There's been a lot of headlines also about China's stance in terms of the war in Ukraine and siding with Russia. But what can the U.S. do to better those relationships with China, or is the relationship sort of, at a standstill right now?
So it's a question of how the United States can prepare ourselves for ongoing challenges in our relationship with China. That means how can we better and strengthen our relationships with countries where China is endeavoring to increase its influence, potentially or intentionally, at the expense of the United States. I would count among those countries throughout Africa, South America, where China is making extraordinary investments in an effort to try and create relationships, economic needs between those countries and China. I think the United States needs to continue to stand strong in our support of our Ukrainian allies and make clear that any country that is providing aid to Russia as it continues to wage a war against Ukraine and commit war crimes on the ground against civilians is making a choice that it is siding with anti-democratic forces. And we should continue to rally our allies in opposition not only to this war, not only in support of Ukraine, but also in opposition to anyone and any nation that would provide any level of support to Russia. And then we need to long-term look at our own strategies for engaging globally. The United States has historically been an important global leader economically and from a security standpoint. And as there's been ebbs and flows with administrations, and certainly with the last administration, as we walked away from some of our international friendships, partnerships, and position of leadership, that we've ceded a bit of ground to a country like China. So ensuring that we are making clear that the United States continues to be a global leader on national security issues of our own, but also in support of democracy and in support of an economy that is driven by not only our interests, but the interests of our partners. And then importantly, we need to make clear through our own legislative process that any weaknesses or holes and gaps in our laws, that we can strengthen those to protect American consumers, to protect our intellectual property, and to ensure that we can compete. Particularly as it relates to competition with companies that may have real strong ties to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government.
Finally, you have worked in a very bipartisan manner with Congressman Chip Roy from Texas when it comes to achieving a stock trade ban. And I know that you've called for a new hearing on that subject. What's the progress of that? Can we expect to see a hearing soon?
Well, Congressman Chip Roy and I just testified before a member hearing with the House Administration Committee to highlight the importance of this legislation, to request that our colleagues hold a standalone hearing on the topic of banning members of Congress from buying or selling individual stocks. Not only did we, as the lead sponsors of this bill, testify before our colleagues, but so did a number of other colleagues. We continue to increase our co-sponsorship of this legislation, Democrats and Republicans, building a broad base of support. And we continue to move forward, working towards a hearing in the House Administration Committee and ultimately a vote on the House floor. I am optimistic that there is a path forward, and Congressman Roy and I are working aggressively to find it and follow it.
And we'll be keeping an eye out for it. Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And my next guest is Giselle Barreto-Fetterman, an access and equity advocate who played a key role in her husband, Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman's election bid last year. Welcome, Giselle, and happy Women's History Month.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so before we get started on some of the other questions I have for you, I know that you've recently become a volunteer firefighter. Tell us about that experience. That's really interesting.
It's amazing. It was a dream since I was a little kid. And, you know, I was the oldest person at the academy. So I'm at this place in my life where now I'm the oldest in some rooms, which is new. But I've responded to 25 calls so far. And I'm loving every second of the journey.
Oh, that's excellent. It's a world I don't know too much about, but I'm sure, it's amazing to have really all hands on deck in those situations. You're also really big into your philanthropic work and play such a big role. I know that you founded 412 Food Rescue and the volunteer-run Free Store. I wanted to talk to you about food insecurity and the work you've done and really try to spread awareness about this issue that probably doesn't get covered as much as it should.
Yeah, I think, people like to imagine food insecure neighbors look like, something very far away from us. In reality, it's the grandmother down the street. The numbers are really high. It's 1 in 6 and 1 in 7. And when you look at food waste in this country, those numbers are about 40%. And, I was a former math major. I know that those numbers don't add up. And I could see that there was a better way to do things. That's why Hugh was born. My dogs are saying hello. It was a way to be creative and find solutions with what we already have. And as we see cuts that want to be made to SNAP and other things happening, you can see why this is such an important issue. I know that if I'm hungry, I'm not my best. And that's happening in schools every morning with children. You can't learn if you're hungry. You're not your best in any way if you're hungry.
Yeah, absolutely. And, moving on to another area you often speak about is your background. When you first came to this country, you are an undocumented immigrant, but you've really spoken about the need for compassionate immigration and a compassionate approach to this topic. How would you hope that the administration, lawmakers, stakeholders in this realm, how should they approach immigration, and what does compassionate immigration look like?
I think it's remembering that these are people, these are families, these are children, these aren't numbers. I've tried to put a face to immigration. I'm a former dreamer, which means I was brought to this country as a child. My family was fleeing violent conditions in my country. So we talk about immigration like it's something that's really far away, right? But I went to school with your children, and they were my best friends. And I think it's important to want all children to thrive, right? And compassionate means that you're looking at it as people and you're not looking at it as numbers or bargaining chips. And I think historically, that's what we've seen. We've always been bargaining chips instead of humans who deserve compassion, support, and an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And, going forward in terms of immigration, is there any piece of legislation or any initiative that you're looking at in particular into, how this situation is handled? We've seen that immigration has become a bit of a political football, if you will, with Republicans using it to attack the president, at the situation at the southern border. So, what are you looking forward to seeing being done on this issue?
Well, since I'm not, a legislator, I'm always going to be an advocate, and I will look at what will, I think, be best for our country and for everyone. So I think there's different pieces out there, and I will continue to support those that I believe would get us closer to something that I think we deserve to see for America, right? We look at the labor market. We know how much it's struggling. We know that immigrants can make a big difference in so many ways and are a great contribution. But for me, I always felt so American. I knew that I was American, and the only thing that was missing for me was a piece of paper.
And you made such a good point there. You said you're an advocate, and this Women's History Month, I think a lot of us have been looking to see how we can uplift other women advocates and make sure there's proper intersectionality there. How would you encourage other women looking to get into philanthropy, politics, these advocacy fields in general? What kind of a piece of advice is it? What would you give them going forward? A piece of advice, if you will. Well,
I'll say all my heroes are women, so I am rooting for you. But I think our voices and our perspective is needed in all spaces, right? We're needed in the fire service. There's very few women in the fire service. We're needed in all these rooms. And I think it's easy to think that we don't belong in these spaces because we've been historically told that we don't. But I think simply doing this work is rebellion in a way, right? Our perspective is really unique and important, and it's needed. I remember reading something that there are more Johns in the Senate than there are mothers of young children. And a mother's perspective is really important. So I want to keep my John in, but it is important to have women's voices in all spaces.
Right. And you played such an integral role on the campaign trail last cycle, campaigning in a major swing state where, arguably one of the biggest women's issues, abortion access, was very much on top of that ballot. What was that experience like? Because you became, very much a known entity during that campaign, and so many of us have been introduced to you now.
Not very fun. I'm not particularly, I don't love politics. I think that it will be better. I will love it when there is more great people in it. But it was an honor to be a part of it. I got to share a message that I so much believe in, which is my husband's and his vision, and got to be part of history and, changing a seat. So all that was great. And traveling the state and meeting with folks, I love all that part of it. The politics has so much of the icky stuff that I don't particularly enjoy.
Do you think that's why you're more attracted to advocacy over politics? Because it seems like, at least I'm a journalist, so I'm not directly involved in advocacy, but it seems like it's more of a roundtable discussion. It's not nearly as cutthroat as the political world.
Yeah, I'm not. My heart is too soft for politics. And that's okay. But I think, nonprofit for me is the place I found to work on where policy has failed people, right? We work to fill those gaps that policy could fix, but hasn't yet. And it never will fully be there. But if we can help fill those spaces, then I feel like we're doing something that's really important and needed.
Yeah. And, what would be a piece of advice you would give to a young woman looking to get into advocacy? What would you tell her? What does that path look like?
So for me, it's always been about what keeps me up at night. So my work has always been based on pain in some way, right? So when I was a young immigrant to this country, we dumpster dived, and I saw firsthand what grocery stores throughout, this perfectly good food that could have fed families, instead was in a landfill, in a dumpster. So I took those experiences, the experiences that were painful, weren't that positive, and I thought, how can we work to ease the suffering for someone else? So I always tell people, find what keeps you up at night. What's that thing that hurts you? Is it injustice? Is it, inequality for women? What is that thing that tugs at you, and do that thing, like work on that. And I think that's how we find our path.
Yeah, that's such good advice, especially during Women's History Month, those of us pushing back against inequality in that realm. Giselle Barreto-Fetterman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And let's see, my next guest, Sarah Kate Ellis, became president and CEO of GLAAD in 2014 after a successful career as a media executive. GLAAD is the world's largest LGBTQ media advocacy organization. Welcome, Sarah Kate.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Happy Women's History Month, Sarah Kate. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to celebrate and put a spotlight on women.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I heard you at the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report, and you were at Davos, at this year's World Economic Council, and you said that inclusion is not a buzzword, but a fundamental value. How do you think companies can, sit here and, in working to include more people from the LGBTQ population, how can they better use inclusion and making it a fundamental value?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important point. I think it's a point that's under fire right now, especially being politicized in this country. But we've seen it time and time again. If you care about your bottom line, then you absolutely need to care about diversity and inclusion, because it leads to bottom line growth and top line growth, honestly. And so, when you look at inclusion and you look at it through the spectrum of all marginalized communities, I mean, there's so many of us who don't have a seat at the table, right? And the table is largely controlled by a small group of people who have had control for years and years and decades and centuries, actually. And when you do bring new thought, innovation happens at those tables and growth happens as a result of them. And I think for, women, for LGBTQ folks, for people of color, I think what we're looking for is to be contributors and participants in this global economy and in the economy here in the United States.
Right. And, speaking of representation, I know that GLAAD recently released its Where We Are on TV report, and the number of LGBTQ characters actually dropped from last year. It's now 596 to 637. Some people looking at that report might say, well, it's just, roughly, 100 characters down. But, we know that representation is obviously very important. And if you're an LGBTQ viewer, that's essential for you. I would love to hear what it means, as a part of the LGBTQ community, for members of these communities to see themselves on TV and what that means in terms of inclusion.
Yeah, what we see on TV influences and impacts how we vote at the polls, what happens on school boards, what happens in churches, what happens in community centers. It has an outsized influence on our culture. And so to see the number of characters of LGBTQ folks drop at a time when we're seeing an onslaught of over 400 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed at legislation, you can see from my seat and where I sit and what I do on a daily basis, I see a correlation here. We are a community who has largely been invisible, except for the past, decade or two. And so our visibility is paramount for us being treated fairly, equally, and living in society safely. And so one of the main ways to have that visibility is through storytelling. If you look specifically at the trans community, transgender women, what we're seeing is that, if you ask people, do you know someone who's gay in America? 90% of Americans will say they know someone who's gay. If you ask if you know someone who's transgender, that number significantly drops to 13 to 16%. And so the way people are understanding who trans folks are in America is through media, is through storytelling. And what's happening right now is because there is a gap, the politicians are filling that gap with misinformation and lies about the community.
Yeah, and we are seeing this happening in the Republican presidential primary. For example, my colleague Brooke Migden and I have a piece out today about how this rhetoric is really transpiring in that primary. And then we know earlier this week, Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders signed in a law that would ban transgender people from using the restroom that corresponds with their own gender. And we know that last week, Wyoming governor, governor of Wyoming signed a legislation barring trans women from competing in women and girls sports. And, there's been this increasingly negative rhetoric in these, policies that would negatively impact the trans community as a whole. But we've seen a lot being said about trans women and seeing these policies that would negatively impact trans women in particular. what is being done in the LGBTQ space, advocacy space, to push back against this? Because, there's likely, there's someone, whoever it is, the Republican nominee for president, is going to be talking about this issue from that very high platform.
Yeah, so from an LGBTQ advocacy standpoint, the movement itself is all band together around this issue because we do exactly what you just said, see this being at the center point of this upcoming presidential race. And what happens, especially with Republican politicians, is that they look for a wedge issue, they look how they can stoke fear, and then they ride that wave until it works against them. And then they leave it. Remember critical race theory? It was a big discussion point until they really lost at the midterm elections. And then it kind of died down, except for, I guess, DeSantis. But other than that, I think that what we're doing is getting out there to educate the American people. Because like I said, 16% of Americans say they know someone who's trans. So it's our job to let Americans know who trans folks are. And I think that's very telling in and of itself. Why all these laws to ban people that only 16% of Americans know? I mean, it's so disproportionate and outsized. And there is no issue here. This is being made into an issue. Trans folks have always existed. There's been a little bit more media attention around them in terms of storytelling, definitely not enough. And so now politicians have harped on that. And we are really doing education campaigns so that people get to know trans community members, people get to know parents of trans kids and what it's like. This is a very marginalized community, and this just puts a target on their back and makes it very unsafe for them.
I want to move on to a Harvard Medical School report that was released last month that found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals have more health issues and less access to proper health care than cisgender people, and they're at greater risk of suicide, cardiovascular issues, different kinds of cancers. Why are we seeing this? Does this have to do with discrimination in health care or a lack of access to health care among members of these communities?
Yes, yes, and yes. It is discrimination, part of that. It's all systemic, right? That when you are a part of a marginalized community, you have less access. You have less access to financial, economic well-being, which gives you less access to good medical help, which gives you less access or more access to being discriminated against where you can get medical help. And I also think because our community has felt shame for who they are, made to feel shameful for who they are, we have higher stress levels. And that leads to obviously higher contemplation of suicide rates, and poor behavior around our health because we don't value ourselves as much as we should.
Sarah Kate, before I let you go, if there are any young LGBTQ women or young LGBTQ people watching in general, what's one piece of advice you could give them today?
I think that even though it's very, very hard right now in the climate and the culture that we are living in, that the American people are for equality, they're for acceptance, and I hope you hold on and join the fight and join our movement and take good care of yourself.
Well, Sarah Kate, that's a wonderful message. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us, and happy Women's History Month.
Thank you.
Thank you. I sat down with Senator Joni Ernst, a Republican from Iowa, who serves as the ranking member of the Senate Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee last week. Take a listen.
Senator Ernst, thank you so much for joining us, and happy Women's History Month. It's really great to have you here today.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you as well. I'm so excited to talk about our conversation or have a conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to get to a couple news of the day topics. Your home state of Iowa is really, taking center stage in the headlines, especially for obviously the Republican presidential primary. We saw former President Trump there last night, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis taking a trip there as well. And then I know you sat down with former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, over the weekend. What have you been seeing in Iowa, and what's your reaction to the field so far?
Well, this is so exciting. I am just so thrilled that Iowa maintains the first in the nation caucus for the Republicans. And Iowans are geared up and ready to go. So whether it's Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley, they are just thrilled to have these folks visiting Iowa, having those conversations, answering questions. And I am so excited, and I know Iowans are too. So it is going to be a great couple of years.
And did you get a chance to see former President Trump's address last night? He really, it seems like, went on the attack against Governor DeSantis.
Yeah, I did have other events last night, so I was trying to catch little snippets where I could. But I think as Republicans, we should maintain that gold standard and not attack one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to move on to official business. Now, you are the ranking member on the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. And there was a recent Goldman Sachs study I came across that found that 99% of female small business owners said they believe the U.S. government needs to do a bit more to support women-owned enterprises. I wanted to get a sense as to what you and your committee are doing to support female small businesses across the country.
Yes, I do have a number of initiatives that I have sponsored and led in several of the past Congresses and the Small Business Committee, large in part encouraging the federal government to take a look at women-owned small businesses. We offer all kinds of opportunities, whether it's contracting with the federal government. There are goals set with our departments across the federal government. But most of the time, the federal government isn't even scratching the surface in meeting those goals. So making sure that the federal government is living up to their obligations that are long existing in code is extremely important. But then also focusing on other initiatives for women-owned small businesses. We know how important childcare is to those women that want to engage in their own small businesses, be young entrepreneurs. But they're oftentimes starting a family or have small children. So we know that childcare opportunities are very, very important. So whether it's rules and regulations, forcing the federal government to live up to their own standards, or just offering ideas or alternatives for supports like childcare, very important ideas and thoughts that we can tackle in the Small Business Committee.
Yeah, and I've spent the past month talking to a lot of women in various different fields, and Republican, Democratic women, nonpartisan women, and what they say is we really need to invest in women. And when you say childcare, that seems to really fall under that category of investing in women. How else can we invest in women to make sure they're thriving in the workforce?
Well, as well with the child care, you do have to think sometimes about paid family leave as well, which is a little different than child care, but making sure that, one, I don't think the government should, be heavy-handed in this area. We have to have conservative, creative ways of providing opportunities for women, small business owners, that if they have to have time off or their employees need time off, that they can remain flexible in that area and providing that level of benefit for the employees. So that is another way that we can assist with small business owners and allowing women and men to take time off if they have a new child that is entering into their family. But certainly medical areas as well. And I know this crosses into many other committees within the United States Senate. But finding ways that perhaps small businesses can come together and share those opportunities and expenses when it comes to medical expense. So there's a lot of ways that as the federal government, we should be flexible in some of these opportunities, but those are great ways to support women.
Yeah, and Senator, I want to pivot to another topic, a topic that's really become kind of a part of our national cultural conversation. And this is about the topic of women in their so-called prime. We know that, I believe it was earlier this month or last month, CNN's Don Lemon, said that Nikki Haley was not in her prime. And I saw Republican, Democratic women, independent women coming out and pushing back on that notion. And even at the Academy Awards the other night, we saw a winner say, Michelle Yeoh say, ladies, don't let anyone ever tell you you are not in your prime. I want to get your sense as to when a woman is in her prime, and if you faced ageism in the workforce for being too young or too old. Because in my research, what I've been seeing is that ageism seems to be a issue that women of all ages are facing.
Absolutely. And how absolutely inappropriate his comments were. We have a president that is 80 years old. Don Lemon, you said 51 is too old for a woman, or that Nikki Haley was out of her prime. Then I'd love to hear his thoughts on President Biden. I am older than Nikki Haley, and I would say don't let the silver hair fool you. I certainly have done and accomplished more in my lifetime than Don Lemon, and I would just like to let Don know that I have a lot more coming. So women, ladies out there, I don't care if you are 18 or 80. Every woman contributes, whether it's in her own home, whether it is in a small business as a small business owner, or for heaven's sakes, maybe as president of the United States. I would say that age does not limit our abilities and contributions. And I would think of all people, Don Lemon should acknowledge that and understand that. We have strong women. Women are leaders here in the Senate, in the House. And I don't care about age. I think it comes down to skills, abilities, and a willingness to collaborate together. There should be no man putting a limit on our abilities.
Absolutely. Well, Senator, thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate your time as well. And happy Women's History Month as well.
Happy Women's History Month.
My next guest is Isabel Casillas Guzman, the Small Business Administrator, which represents more than 30 million U.S. small businesses. Welcome, Administrator Guzman, and happy Women's History Month.
Yes, thanks for having me. Happy Women's History Month.
Yes. Well, thank you for taking the time. I want to start with your background. I know that you grew up in a family that had a small business, and then you later started your own small business. So, I would love to hear how, how did that background and that experience shape you as a woman leader leading the Small Business Administration?
Yes, well, yeah, I definitely grew a passion for small businesses, working in my dad's hospitals, seeing him interact with customers. Everybody who walked through that door was such an important part of his business, and ultimately, my family and a part of our community. And having an entrepreneurial spirit with that passion for what you're doing, but also that hard work ethic and grit and determination. I think those things are what I saw him performing every day, and really managing so many different tasks, to having to be flexible and agile. And I think those skills just carried through my whole life, and really built my passion for working with small businesses, advising founders, starting my own businesses as well.
Yeah, and I would love to hear about some of the initiatives the Small Business Administration is putting forth that would empower all small business owners. But since we are here talking about women, how it would empower women business owners as well.
Oh, I love that question too, because when we think about entrepreneurship today, well, the face of entrepreneurship is changing. It is actually women who are starting businesses at the highest rates. And so it's very appropriate during Women's History Month that we talk about entrepreneurship as really a pathway to prosperity, a pathway to building wealth for families and communities. And we see so many women taking that leap And the Biden-Harris administration in particular wants to ensure that there are support products and services to ensure that our entrepreneurs, regardless of backgrounds, can have greater success outcomes. The president talks about building an economy that works for everyone, or building an economy from the bottom up and the middle out, which really is a startup. That's a bootstrap small business from my perspective. And our female entrepreneurs, as well as all of our entrepreneurs who face historic barriers that we saw laid out during the pandemic, really need to make sure that we're working hard to fill gaps in access. So gaps in access to funding. We know that women don't get the investment levels that their male counterparts do. And so we want to make sure the SBA has capital products, loans, investments, grants through the innovation research grants in the federal government, as well as networks to support them in their journey of entrepreneurism.
Yeah, and you said a key word there, invest. And a lot of other interviews I've done for the series, I've asked women leaders, how do we invest in women? Because it seems that that's sort of the key here, whether you're talking about business or politics or the military, it's all about investing in women so they have the appropriate infrastructure to thrive in these fields. So when it comes to businesses, how can they invest in women going forward?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, women are represented in so many industries across the board, and we've seen a historic boom in small businesses. New business applications were 10.4 million in the president's first 2 years. It's 84% higher than historic records, which just basically means a lot of people are seeking those opportunities or seeking to pursue that great idea that they've had for quite some time. And for women entrepreneurs, we want to make sure that they have the skills to have that confidence, to have a growth mindset, to be able to ensure that they're, looking to not only, work their business every day in their business, but work on their business to make sure it can grow and foster. So we've expanded our networks. The American Rescue Plan funded an expanded network of navigators and, of course, our incredible women's business centers to give them that added skill set to make sure that they can succeed in the marketplace and connect them to capital. Make sure that they know that there are lenders out there that are there to provide them funding, and especially women who are getting started, or they may have those needs for smaller dollar loans. We had seen a decline in small dollar loans previously, and so we want to make sure that the SBA is fixing its capital programs to meet businesses where they are with that initial funding. And I know there's some incredible stories, but women who started with that first SBA loan to then grow their business through federal contracting or exports, or through our great technical assistance programs. And that's what we're committed to, replicating those successes.
Yeah. And, you're also a Latina leader in this sector. And we know that Latina-owned businesses are some of the fastest growing in this country. I think according to the National Women's Business Council, they've seen a growth of 87%, more than that since 2007. Talk about that growth and what we can expect to see from Latina-owned businesses. It seems like there's a bright future on the horizon for them.
That's right. The women of color are starting businesses amongst that changing face of entrepreneurship at the highest rates within that category. And Black and brown women in particular have been leading on those entrepreneurship rates, for over a decade. And the community is highly entrepreneurial, of course. But in addition, I think what's important to note is that they'll face an added layer of barriers as there are inequities that the people of color face in addition within our capital markets, within our networks. And so, again, it's about investing. We need to invest in the entrepreneurs who are starting and going to be creating the jobs of the future. And so we are focused on equity and making sure that our programs are accessible to all. And that means meeting our businesses where they are, having a technology to make sure that they're accessing digital markets, or being able to export and take advantage of their language or cultural connection to markets abroad and get into federal contracting. But I think, for our Latina entrepreneurs, for all of our women entrepreneurs out there, it's recognizing that the SBA at sba.gov is here to help you with your business and figure out those skills that you need to strengthen and teach them to you so that you can grow your business successfully.
So when we make the case to invest in women, what would you say sets female entrepreneurs apart from their male counterparts? What do women bring to the table?
Well, we know that diverse teams succeed, and so across the board, they have strong outcomes. We see that in numerous studies, but obviously when women bring to the table, and we know some of their skill sets are they've had to persevere, they've had great resilience. I just discussed this with a few founders, and balancing their family, sometimes children, knowing how to continue to pursue their dreams, and doing it on behalf of their family members, trying to better the lives for their children and their future. Oftentimes a great motivator, but clearly they collaborate and work in teams and really bring a new unique skill set that is understanding this massive marketplace of women who are the ones who oftentimes control the purse strings in households and are the ones buying. And so they come with a unique insights into what women want, and they're making the products and delivering the services that are meeting those needs and having great success in the marketplace.
So my final question to you is, what advice would you give to a young woman who is starting her career, maybe wants to start a small business in a hopefully soon to be post-pandemic world? It seems like we're headed in that direction, in an economy where there is some concern about inflation in the future ahead. What would your advice be to that young woman?
To that young woman, whatever that startup is, but as well to all the existing businesses.
Yes.
A couple things. I mean, the president is investing in America, making sure that there's opportunities, whether that's in manufacturing and supply chain, in innovation and R&D. We want America to continue leading globally across sectors of innovation, including in the clean energy space. And so the historic investments in the Inflation Reduction Act and clean energy, or the Chips and Science Act, will definitely advance that, as well as the opportunities for contracts and broadband as we rebuild our infrastructure across the nation. And so I see great opportunities on the horizon for all of our entrepreneurs. What I would say is really important is that as we're navigating and trying to build resilience businesses, making sure that you're focused on a strong balance sheet and understanding your financials, and making sure you have a strong marketing plan to build your revenues. And these are all skill sets that we teach through our network of advisors, our Women's Business Center network across the country, to help entrepreneurs position themselves for success and go after those opportunities, and know that there's a free network of advisory services at the SBA that are made just for you to help grow your business.
Yeah, I want to clarify that you don't have to be a young woman to start a business. You can be any age. The world is your oyster. Administrator, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. My next guest went from being an undocumented immigrant to a best-selling author and reporter on MSNBC. Please welcome Daniela Pierre Bravo, a reporter for MSNBC and the author of the book, The Other, How to Own Your Power at Work as a Woman of Color. Daniela, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Julia, it's so good to be with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so just to get started, I read The Other. I thought it was a fantastic read. Explain for our viewers who haven't read it what The Other means.
The Other is basically seeing yourself through the eyes of somebody else. And it's really at the core and the heart of the book. It is intended for women who have felt like the other, who have felt overlooked, and who follow these rules, these unwritten rules of inclusion in order to find belonging and success. And I talk about my own story, trying to find success through assimilation, and I profile other women of color. And it's not just my story, but it's the story of so many women who basically lose themselves and fragment their identities in order to find success. And then as they move along in their careers, they have trouble taking up space. So this book is all about kind of understanding our journeys and empowering us, and really showing women how to use their power when they do have a seat at the table.
Yeah, and your story is so remarkable. After you emigrated to the United States from Chile, you lived in Lima, Ohio, and I know that you went to Miami of Ohio after that, and then ended up in New York City. But a lot of your journey was as an undocumented immigrant, and there was one passage from the book that really was powerful to me when President Obama announced, I believe it was in 2012, that he was granting that temporary relief to dreamers, younger people who had been brought here as minors to the United States, and how you were in that deli watching this play out and you wanted to hug everyone around you, but everyone was just acting like it was business as usual. But I'm curious, you grew up in a very predominantly white town, conservative-leaning town. What was, did you have a community? Obviously you had your family, but were you able to connect with other people, for example, online, people of color, other undocumented immigrants who really shared more of your experience?
Thank you for that question. It was actually very alienating. I had no idea people like me existed. I remember being 15 and 16 years old, not knowing that there was another undocumented person. I was kind of looking in the corners of the internet for community boards to try to find people like me. And so thank you for bringing up that moment in the deli when President Obama delivered his speech on executive action, because it didn't just give me an opportunity to have an identity, an ID, but it allowed me to understand that there were almost 1 million people like me. And that sense of being seen and that sense of having a community of people who have gone through the same thing was incredibly empowering, because I was doing all of these things in vain. And I actually don't think my story is unique at all. I think it's the story of so many women of color around this country who work hard, who have to take 2 or 3 jobs to get themselves through college, who do the unpaid internships, plus 4 side jobs. For me, I know you read this, but lying on my resume and saying that I lived in New York City so that I could get a call back for an unpaid internship in New York. And so it's that grit and resilience that is a great thing to have. But in the book, I talk about how in some ways, as you move along, you operate on those same rules, and it doesn't always lead to success.
Yeah, and you also talk about essentially imposter syndrome. And I think women in general go through this. I go through this. But for women of color, there's an added layer to it. And it's a whole other ball game of feeling that, you've reached this point in your career, or you're in this program in your education, and you just almost sometimes feel like you don't necessarily deserve it, or you're wondering, why am I here? Why me? How can we as women, and of course, particularly women of color, push back against that feeling of imposter syndrome?
Well, first, it's understanding the context of which we hear or feel that way. If we're talking about women of color, I've interviewed a lot of women of color for my book, and I've done research on this. The women that are coming up actually don't have a confidence problem. What they're actually up against is real microaggressions and covert and overt racism. And so when we talk about imposter syndrome and kind of feeling like you don't deserve to be there, a lot of these women have been made to feel like they don't deserve to be there through microaggressions and through covert and overt bias. And so it's something that's important to understand, because the message in the book is that it's not you. It's you're not the problem. And I think a lot of us internalize that for ourselves, because we, in some way, shape, or form, our identities have been kind of intertwined with this feeling of not being good enough, of being the one and the only. And so when we talk about imposter syndrome, I think it's important to have that context.
Yeah, and if the problem is, the surroundings of a woman or, her environment, how can we work to change that environment? I know that's a loaded question. Sometimes in larger organizations, it's difficult to, but where does this begin? How can we start at the grassroots level to start lifting up women and women of color to where they don't have to deal with, as many microaggressions or microaggressions at all?
It starts from the top down. When we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, there's billions of dollars being spent on these efforts, which is great. But what often happens, and the women that I've interviewed also told me this, is that they're recruited, they get there, they have a seat at the table, but then they're dismissed or discarded or not really allowed to do their job because people are not comfortable seeing someone like them with power. And so I think it's an institutional and a structural problem. In the book, I really talk about practical tips on the parts that we can actually control, which is limited. But if we're talking about a big solution, it absolutely starts from the top down.
Yeah, and you talk about, I think you wrote about this one experience from a woman you interviewed, I think a young Latina woman. She was working for a larger firm, and she was called into a meeting for cosmetics that were owned, Latina-owned cosmetics, I believe. And then it became clear that she was it seemed to me that she was being used as a prop, and she ended up walking away and started her own company, which is amazing. But, that's a risk. And you've taken a number of risks throughout, your journey and in your career. So, I would love to hear your advice on women who are looking to take a risk in their career, to maybe walk away from an environment or a situation that isn't serving them.
Yeah, what I talk about in the book is really to examine our relationship with risk. For a lot of women who started out with little, or women of color, there's a sense that if you mess something up, or if you don't do the right thing, then that opportunity is fleeting, and then it'll be automatically taken away from you. And a lot of us haven't seen that generational opportunity open up for our families. And so when you are the first and you are the only and you have that seat at the table, it can be intimidating to take that risk. But I think the pandemic also showed this, that women having a seat at the table but not being able to use it, there is a burnout and there's a frustration. And so this is what you're going to see. And this is a call to companies to say, if you don't give women equity, they're going to burn out and they're going to go out and do their own thing. And, I think it's one of the reasons why you see so many numbers of entrepreneurial women, especially women of color, that are sort of coming up in these last couple of years, because they are not seeing that equity in their workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up such an important point about the seat at the table. We use that phrase so much, but what's important is that we can use that seat of the table and use our voices and empower those around us to use their voices. Daniela Piera Bravo, thank you so much for joining me.
Julia, thank you so much.
My next guest is Hannah Freed, co-founder and executive director of All Voting is Local and All Voting is Local Action. All Voting is Local is a nonpartisan organization that seeks to make voting safe, fair, and accessible for all. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yes, and happy Women's History Month. It's great to chat with women leaders like you who are making so much progress in the space that you work with. And just to start on that note, you work with protecting, voters' rights and, the protection to be able to safely cast a ballot without intimidation. What would you say, just a scene setter for our viewers, is the greatest threat to American voting right now in terms of voter suppression?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's, it is one that I'm answering differently now than I probably would have a few years ago. We say a lot at our organization that we got into this work because we wanted to, fight polling place closures in communities of color. We wanted to make sure that voters had safe and easy access to voter registration and voting in person and vote by mail. That is still the case, right? Those threats are still very present, particularly for Black and Brown voters, Native American voters, others who've been historically kind of left out, pushed out of the voting process. But in this moment, I think that the threat of election denial, questioning of election results for no good reason, right? Without basis, without foundation, this kind of reliance on conspiracy theories to make policies, right? That is a true and existential threat. And I think we've really seen that in the evolution of our work. And I think it's the moment that we're in right now.
Yeah, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on some of these figures. Most of them do, or at least all of them, I believe, come from the conservative or Republican side of the aisle. When we talk about this issue with, for example, Carrie Lake, she was a gubernatorial candidate in Arizona last cycle, and she has still yet to concede that race. Critics from the left would say that, maybe to a lesser extent, but at the same time, Stacey Abrams, or critics from the right, would say that Stacey Abrams was pushing an unfair, unfair narrative that she actually won the election in Georgia in 2018. But with these figures like Carrie Lake, for example, these are figures that are very much on the rise in conservative politics. She won the straw poll at CPAC to be, President Trump's vice presidential pick, or the Republican ticket's vice presidential pick. How concerned are you that there are these leaders who are really much garnering or gaining a following and continuing to be on the rise like this?
Sure. So, I think the way that we think about it, I'll say, we're a nonpartisan org, right? But, I think the thing that we're really interested in is what is the kind of environment in which voters are going to cast their ballots, right? And if voters are going to cast their ballots in an environment in which leaders at the highest levels, right, the highest levels of government in some cases, right, whether it's state government or certainly in 2020, the White House, are relying on kind of propagating disinformation, lies about the ways that our elections are run, that creates an environment in which voters start to feel like, okay, my vote isn't going to count. And I don't know if I even want to vote. And that is where we really, from our organizational perspective, that's really where we start to worry. What we want to see is elections officials, candidates who are accepting election results, right? I mean, that is the baseline on which our kind of democracy is built. And I think, you asked me at the start, sort of like, what have we seen change? I think there are certain things that we all used to be able to agree on. I don't think that's the case anymore. Yeah. And I think our system is really being pressure tested, right? Because it wasn't built for these kind of outlier cases, right? Where you've got people absolutely for months refusing to concede. I will say, I do want to kind of push a little on the notion that, drawing comparisons, between everybody who kind of questions the fairness of our system. I mean, we question the fairness of our system all the time. Voter suppression is real. Black voters, Latino voters, Native American voters have, since this country's founding, faced, in some cases, outright prohibitions on voting. And then over time, hurdles to accessing the ballot box. Those threats are real, right? And the intention of those, right? What motivates them, what motivates creating those barriers can be racism, it can be power grabs, and it's ugly no matter what it comes down to. But I think that what we're talking about here with this threat of the questioning of election results goes to something much more fundamental, much more existential. And it is scary. It is a new thing for our country to be facing. I will say, coming out of 2022, I think we have reason for optimism that this may not be here to stay. It may go back to the margins where it belongs, but it is a real and existential threat that we have to continue to activate against.
Right. And I think that's really interesting that you bring that up, because as a reporter, you ask Republicans about this issue. The first person they bring up, like I said, was Stacey Abrams. On the left, you ask them about this issue. They bring up figures like Carrie Lake. Clearly can't compare, apples and oranges there. So how do we get past this being a partisan issue? I mean, because I think it's just become, unfortunately, a very partisan issue. And, it's all about, it's just become politics as normal. So how do we get past that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm an eternal optimist, I would say. There was a time not so long ago where there actually was a lot of common ground to be found here, right? I mean, if you think about the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, about 15 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. There has been bipartisanship in how we approach sort of fundamentals of voter access. That is not where we are now, right? But I will say, as I mentioned a minute ago, I think coming out of 2022, I think we really did see a repudiation of election denial. And I don't just mean electorally, although, there's been plenty of commentary about that too. I mean, in the way that votes were counted, right? We saw elections officials stand up and say, I'm going to follow the law here, right? And these are the facts, and I'm going to stick with them. And that is what we need to continue to see. And I think voters supported that. Voters certainly turned out to ensure that their votes would count. And I think it is that kind of, bravery, frankly, but that will blaze a trail for us forward, just like it did in 2022.
Right, absolutely. And I want to talk about, sort of growing voter turnout and, making it more accessible. Stacey Abrams did do an incredible job in 2020 at making sure more voters of color, more women, more voters who, had trouble getting to certain polling places and such, that they were able to vote. And it did end up making a difference. How can we see that system replicated throughout the country? I mean, can you take that blueprint in Georgia and expand it across the country?
Yeah, and it's not limited to Georgia, though certainly there too. I mean, we saw even in, this past election, we saw big gains. Michigan voters passed Proposition 2, which expanded access to vote by mail. It expanded access to early voting, right? These are, voters show that this is what they want. They show it through their votes, like with Proposition 2 in Michigan, and they show it with their actions, right? Voters use these options when they are available to them on both sides of the aisle, I'll say, right? I mean, that's why some of this stuff is so wild. Vote by mail is wildly popular. People used it in the pandemic, certainly, but people have used it for decades at this point. And voters of all kinds, of all stripes, right? So I think that, if we are actually looking at what it is that voters want, I think that is really our guide. That's also what our organization is really about, is really ensuring that elections officials are listening to, hearing from, and listening to the communities that they're supposed to serve. And when you do that, I mean, that is actually how you get a more inclusive system of registration and voting and vote counting.
Right. And my final question to you is definitely more of a personal one. You are a Ukrainian American woman. Ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, you have seen so many Ukrainians on the forefront, Volodymyr Zelensky to name one, but you've also seen a lot of Ukrainian women. You hear the stories of Olena Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine, what she's doing to, sort of galvanize her people and such during this time of war. And you've seen just the incredible strength of Ukrainians, but particularly Ukrainian women, mothers, daughters, sisters. I wanted to get your take from a personal side, what it's been like for you and your family to watch this conflict, but see so many women who share your heritage really coming to the forefront like never before.
I really appreciate the question. I mean, I talk about my mother is Ukrainian American, and, my grandparents immigrated to this country. And I mean, it is a source of enormous pride for Ukrainian Americans. I mean, I think people were so astounded watching the early coverage of just how bold Ukrainians were in response to the invasion. And, for our family watching that, we were like, I mean, yeah, what did you expect? This is how Ukrainians show up. This is what my mother is like. This is what my grandmother was like. This is what our family identifies as. And so it really is just a moment of incredible pride. And, accompanying this profound sorrow of seeing something like this happen yet again to the country that we come from. But it is really extraordinary to see the persistence and the bravery among Ukrainians, Ukrainian women, and Ukrainian people generally.
Yeah, it really is extraordinary, and to see that even reflected in this country across the world. Hannah Freed, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And my final guest is Ramesh Saparad, an Iranian-American author and scholar, here to talk about the Iranian protests and broader movement against the Iranian regime and the push for democracy. Ramesh, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh my goodness, it's my pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, so just to start off with, last September, 22-year-old Iranian woman Mahsa Amini died after spending 3 days in a coma in custody. She was arrested by the country's Iran's mortality police, who accused her of being in violation of a law that requires women to wear a hijab. It looked like she was severely beaten, and it looks quite suspicious, obviously. We saw protests beginning at her funeral, and it's turned into such a global movement. This isn't the first time we've seen protests and demonstrations from Iran, reach outside of the country's borders. But talk about how this has really exploded into a global movement in support of Iranian women.
Absolutely. Mahsa was the trigger. She was the trigger not just for the internal uprising that reached across all of Iran, but also a global movement. When it comes to that women life freedom, women in every home is waking up to that message, that point of awareness that we can no longer be silent when it comes to misogyny in power and what we see happening inside Iran. So from that perspective, I think Mahsa did her service for the movement, for freedom, for a non-nuclear secular republic in Iran. And I think the reason I say non-nuclear secular republic, because the message of Iranian women is not just for social freedoms, is not just for economic freedom, but it's also for political freedoms. And if you look at Iran's history, in fact, over the last 4 decades, women from all walks of life have been protesting. We just haven't heard about them. And now with the women life freedom, we see that the message is down with the dictators, down with the mullahs, be it the Shah, be it the despots of the past or the current regime, the despots of today. And women of Iran are essentially telling the world, stand with us as we want to change this regime and bring about a republic that really allows women to be free, whether they choose to put the hijab on or they choose to take it off. That would be based on their choice. So I think it's incredible to see the global movement in support of Iranian women. One thing I would add, Julia, is that the response from U.S. Congress has been tremendous when it comes to the support of Iranian women. And I'm talking both the House and the Senate. Just recently, the House Resolution 100 was passed by absolute majority, a very strong bipartisan support for the Iranian people and their uprising as they strive to have a non-nuclear secular republic in Iran, which really offers the administration a policy framework on how to move forward in supporting the people of Iran. And at the helm of it, at the center of it, is the voice of women. At the center of it is the 10-point plan by a female leader, Mayim Rajavi, who has offered what does it look like when this regime is gone, when we could have a secular Iran, when we could have a modern judicial system, free and fair elections, end of the executions, abolishment of the death penalty in Iran, peaceful coexistence with our neighbors, and as well as adherence to all Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of the international treaties, so that Iran can in fact come back to the international community in a more meaningful and in a more productive way versus what we see today in Iran.
Yeah, and it was 43 years ago on International Women's Day where the Iranian regime after the revolution really got its first taste of women in Iran pushing back against the restrictions that that they would face for the 40 years that followed. Talk about the role of Iranian women and pushing back against the regime. You had the revolution, obviously, in 1979, and then in 2009 there was the Green Revolution, and now we're in this, this period of protest. I mean, first of all, is this a revolution, and how are women at the head of it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the only answer I can give you is we have to look into the slogans that's coming from inside Iran. The slogans of the protesters is, don't call it a protest, it's a revolution. So, and it's a revolution on all fronts. It's a revolution to really uproot misogyny that's in power under the mullahs. If you look at Iran's constitution, they have brought such restriction on women's lives. And you talked about the very first March 8th International Women's Day in Iran, right after the revolution. And it was the Iranian regime's thugs and those who attacked the women, and it was the progressive women, it was the various opposition groups at the time, the political groups that had some political freedom to express their platform for a free Iran. But the Iranian regime used religion as a weapon to consolidate its power in the first decade of the revolution. And if you look at the record of human rights violations in Iran, for example, in 1988, there was a massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran. Many of them are women from all ages. We're not just talking a certain age group. We're talking children as young as 13 years old teenagers, all the way to grandmothers as old as 73 years old. So this is a regime that doesn't really think about women's right in just targeting a certain sector of the society. Is women, just because you're a woman, you have an enemy in this regime, and it's what we call a gender apartheid that they have established in the country. So once you look at it from that perspective, you understand why women have been willing to pay the ultimate price and be able to be standing up for their rights, whether they're facing torture or execution, and not backing down because they want freedom, not just for themselves, but for the Iranian society. And it's only natural that you see women have reached the leadership role in fighting this regime over the last 4 decades. You know, if you look at even the protests in the recent months, women and girls have been on the forefront of organizing these protests. There are resistance units that are formed inside Iran that are, women are key element and key part of those resistance units. And again, at the end of the day, we believe women who are the agent for change are going to bring this regime down and establish a republic that would be serving the Iranian society that would be free and democratic.
Unfortunately, over the past month, we've seen really horrific headlines out of Iran about poisonings, and these poisonings seem to be happening to young women who have connections to some of these protests, these demonstrations. What more do we know about these poisonings, and what is being done about this in Iran?
That's right. I think these poisonings, from the reports that I'm seeing and I'm receiving from inside Iran, are intentional. My own family member their children were targeted of these poisoning. But you have to remember, the young girls who were in the streets protesting over the last several months are actually the ones that are making this regime be frightened of them. And the regime is trying to use what's happening in Afghanistan and try to, what I call a copycat, target the young girls in Iran with their poisoning plots against these schools. At the end of the day, if this regime is in power and able to crack down the protests and arrest the protesters, why can't they find the people that are behind these poisoning of the schools? And everyone in Iran essentially says it's the regime that's behind these poisoning, and it's intentional, and they're trying to create a distraction for the Iranian society so that parents and their daughters are not going to the streets protesting. But what we see is the courage of Iranian women. Iran just celebrated a New Year's, the first day of March. But even in the first day of March, on our New Year's, you see protests still happening. And women are taking part in these protests. So regardless of what sort of plot, what sort of game the Iranian regime tries to play to demoralize the Iranian people, they're not going to be successful. The clock is not going back to before September. People are marching on until they bring this regime down and establish a democracy in Iran.
Those of us watching what's happening from the United States in the West, we're getting a very, sort of altered view of what's happening. We know that there's some Western outlets that have been let into Iran, but it seems like they're being closely monitored by the regime. Final question, what's it like to be a woman in Iran right now?
I've been in this country for so many years, so I can't even pretend that I know these days what it's like to be a woman in Iran. But when I talk to them inside, when I talk to my family members, when I talk to my contacts inside Iran, what they're saying is, yes, we are under attack. We are under attack every day, whether it's in our private sphere or in public sphere by the regime. There's a state-sponsored misogyny and war on women that's going on in Iran. But they're not demoralized. They're inspired, they're motivated, they're organized, they're coordinating efforts, whether they are, mothers, daughters, wives, they're mobilizing their male partners, their brothers, their fathers, their sons to work together because they know that their freedom depends on the revolution that is forthcoming in Iran. And they know that this is it. This is their moment. As I said, the change agent that we expect them to be, and they have a role model to follow. When you look at what Maryam Rajavi has done in the past 4 decades, meeting with parliamentarian members, meeting with members of Congress across Europe and US, laying out her platform for a future Iran, and really working on the issue of democracy and freedom in Iran day in and day out. That role model inspires the Iranian people and Iranian women in particular, and they know what it takes to bring this regime down.
Ramesh, thank you so much for carving out some of your time to come speak to us in person. Happy belated New Year, and woman, life, freedom, cannot say it enough.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that brings us to an end of our program today. A big thank you to all of our accomplished speakers and to all of you watching at home. And to those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we'll have a video from the event up on our website shortly. I'm Julia Manchester, and have a great rest of your day.